Good morning. Thank you for this very warm welcome. It's an honor to stand here and to address you. I'm here as a journalist, as the editor of the Kyiv Independent, but most importantly, I'm here as a Ukrainian. It gives me great pleasure that there are several Ukrainians in the room here today. If this event was taking place just 7 months ago, our trip here from Ukraine would have been a very easy one. We would have come to the airport in Kyiv, checked in, had a cup of that horrible, overpriced airport coffee, boarded our flight, and 2 hours later we would be here. It would be so normal and safe. But to come here today, we have to spend at least 20 hours on different trains, and on top of that, take 1 or 2 flights. The trip from Ukraine to anywhere in Europe today takes at least 1 whole day, sometimes 2 days. And for most of it, you don't feel safe because Russia has targeted Ukrainian passenger trains. There are, of course, no more flights from Ukraine. We don't know if our airports have survived because they have been targeted in the very first days of the invasion. It's been 7 months since my life and the lives of millions of Ukrainians have changed forever. I remember the morning that changed my life almost minute by minute. It was the early hours of February 24th. It was a very busy week, and I left office at 3 a.m. In my taxi home, I read news reports citing Western intelligence saying that the Russian invasion of Ukraine will begin before the night ends. There was a sinister sense of inevitability about it. Shortly after, Russian state media started broadcasting dictator Vladimir Putin's new television address to the nation. In this address, he was describing how my country, Ukraine, has been posing a threat to the survival of Russia, and how Russia would not take it anymore. While listening to this address at home, I went on my computer and typed up a short news item, just several sentences long. It said that Putin declared war against Ukraine. I saved it as a draft on our website, and I prayed that I was wrong, that I was misunderstanding something, and that I wouldn't have to publish it. But when the Russian dictator was done speaking, it was clear that I got everything right. I pressed publish, and on top of the Kyiv Independent's website, the big red letters showed up. Putin declares war against Ukraine. That was the scariest headline that I ever had to write. And by the way, it was the right one, because if you check the news from that day, you will see that the New York Times, Reuters, and many other Western media reported the beginning of the invasion as Putin authorizes special military operation. After I published it, I felt sick and I sank to the floor. That's when I heard it. Something was exploding in the sky above my city. I realized that Russia was hitting Kyiv with missiles. You know, we all grow up reading stories about the wars that happened a long time ago. When I was a little child, my grandmother would tell me stories about German soldiers that occupied my hometown. She told me how she labored to rebuild the city after the war, how she was helping repair the bridges that were bombed. Every year in May, my school in Ukraine had events dedicated to World War II. We were honoring the fallen and talking about how big of a tragedy it all was. Then I grew up and I read about the atrocities of the Holocaust and of the atrocities of Soviet soldiers in Germany. At home in Kyiv, I live next to Babyn Yar. That's the place of the largest single massacre of the Holocaust. We all grow up surrounded by the stories of wars and tragedies from our past, and they all seem so distant, so far away from today. Growing up, if I was confident about one thing, it was that I would never have to live through an actual war. Not that I felt totally safe, many things could go wrong in my life. But surely I thought, I would never have to hear missiles pouring down on my city. The stories of wars from our past seem more than distant. They often seem insane. They often seem like they were the result of a fatal mistake, of failed judgment, of rare coincidence that can never repeat itself. Surely we think that can't happen again. It's insane to think that it's even possible. Planes bombing schools and hospitals, armies invading other countries, soldiers committing genocide in the middle of Europe in the year 2022. Surely that all belongs in history books, right? When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, the war came closer to me. But I told myself I'm safe in Kyiv. I'm safe in this big, normal European capital. The war was only in the east, and I was so far west from it. I'm safe, it won't get to me. Does that sound familiar to you? Surely I hated the war and I felt bad for the people suffering in eastern Ukraine, but I personally felt safe. The war was not going to come to me, to my city, because that would be insane, right? And yet there I was, standing in the middle of my small apartment in Kyiv at 4 a.m. on February 24th, hearing loud explosions in the sky. You know, I've read about the bombings of London and Dresden, and it's always about how many buildings were ruined, how much of the city was ruined. I've never given much thought to what exactly people in the cities were feeling when bombs were falling on them. It turns out that an attack from the air brings a sense of complete vulnerability. Knowing that there might be a missile or a bomb on its way that is going to kill you, and you are completely powerless against it. I never wanted to find that out. On that morning of February 24th, I felt powerless, and I thought that my life would end then and there. I remember thinking how strange it is that I would die this way. It is only because of the astonishing bravery, resilience, and unspeakable sacrifices of Ukrainian military that 7 months later I can stand here on the stage in Potsdam and speak to you. Thousands and thousands of my fellow Ukrainians have been less fortunate. Back in February, Western news channels didn't speak of whether Ukraine will fall. They spoke of when Ukraine will fall. My colleagues in Kyiv were receiving many phone calls from European journalists who wanted to interview them about the situation on the ground. They asked them, "What's your plan for when the city falls?" It was never if, only when. Back then, nobody believed that Ukraine could resist Russia, supposedly the second strongest military force in the world. 7 months later, Ukraine has not only not fallen as many expected it to, we are actually pushing Russia back and liberating our cities in the east. The price we are paying is unimaginable. Many thousands of Ukrainians, both military and civilians, have been killed. In the city of Mariupol alone, an estimated 20,000 people were likely killed during the merciless siege of the city by Russia. And you all know of Bucha, a town near Kyiv where Russian soldiers were shooting civilians for fun when they occupied the city this spring. There has never been a more black and white war in recent history. I keep hearing everybody say it. And yet, despite it being so black and white, there's so much disinformation surrounding it. You will hear that reports of Russian atrocities in Ukraine were fake, that those massacres were staged. I wish they were staged. My journalists went on the ground and talked to witnesses, including to those who lost their loved ones. And I can tell you that everything you read about Russian soldiers' crimes in Ukraine is real. You will also hear that Ukraine provoked Russia. That's also a lie. We want nothing from Russia except for it to leave us alone. We don't want their land, they want our land. We don't want to make them speak our language, but they want to make us speak theirs. We don't want to influence what alliances they make, but they want to dictate us what alliances we can make. We don't want to decide their future, but they insist that they must decide ours. You will also hear other stories. You will hear that Ukrainians are nationalists. Why is it that when Americans or Germans love their country, it is called patriotism, but when Ukrainians love their country, it's called nationalism? I'll tell you why. If you make that association in your head, if you hear of Ukraine and you think of nationalism, it's because Russia has spent over a decade and millions of dollars to put that association in your head. You may also hear extreme stories saying that many Ukrainians are far-right. You should know that those far-right exist in Russian propaganda and in the imagination of some Western commentators. You should know that not a single time has a far-right political force been able to get any representation in Ukrainian parliament, unlike in many European countries. Our president is Jewish, and he was elected by over 70% of the vote. Russia calls him Nazi. If you think that it's insane, it's because it is. Another lie you will hear is that Russia doesn't suffer from the sanctions. In fact, you will hear that sanctions are harming Europe more than Russia. That's also not true. Yes, Russian economy is still working, partly due to unprecedented draconian currency controls. But economists say it is significantly weakened and may even be collapsing. Another popular narrative is that the war in Ukraine is still in the spotlight from other countries in crisis. I think we all agree that every crisis deserves attention, and the world is big enough to pay attention to more than one at the same time. So what's the purpose of spreading these fake narratives? Why are there so many of them, and why are they so persistent and sometimes even successful? Why is Russia trying so hard to mass produce and spread them? I'll tell you why. Because for Russia, everything is at stake. Its whole future depends on whether you will believe Russia's version of events. For Russia right now, there is only one main goal. And it's not taking some Ukrainian city or moving the front line. No. The goal is to break up the unity of the West. Russia spreads these false narratives vigorously because it knows that there is only one way that it can win the war: if the West's unity and support for Ukraine crumbles. If Europe and the United States continue to stand behind Ukraine and increase their aid to Ukraine, Russia has no chance against this alliance, and they know it. And we've seen it last week when Ukrainian forces suddenly pushed Russia out of one of its eastern regions, Kharkiv Oblast. The whole myth about the strength of Russian army is just crumbling. I'm no military analyst, but some have been calling it the most successful counteroffensive since the World War II. And I can't begin to tell you what this news meant for us, for Ukrainians. In my thoughts, I keep going back to that morning in February when I thought that I would die under missiles and the world thought that Ukraine would perish within days. How the tables have turned. 7 months later, Ukraine is standing strong. Two things account for it. First, the incredible resilience of Ukrainian people, both military and civilians. Second, the help of our allies. But what's next? Where do we go from here? President Volodymyr Zelensky said last week that the next 90 days will decide more than the previous 30 years. And he didn't mean that just for Ukraine. This winter, Russia will try to break the unity of the West. It will use all kinds of blackmail and disinformation techniques to make the world believe that it's easier to give Ukraine up, that it's easier to sacrifice this one country and tame the beast. But the beast in question, Russia, can't be tamed. It can only be defeated. If the West sacrifices Ukraine today, Russia will come for more tomorrow. Next, it will be Georgia, Latvia, Kazakhstan, and more. Because don't forget, this isn't a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's the war between two opposite polar sets of values and principles. It's authoritarian regime against democracy. It's dictatorship against freedom. And the winner of this war will determine the future of the world, not of our world in Ukraine, but of your world everywhere. Because make no mistake, there is no place to hide from this threat. You may think that you are safe, but the fact is there is a very thin layer of normalcy that stands between your everyday life in Potsdam, Berlin, or Brussels, and the kind of reality that Ukrainians are living in right now. You are not untouchable for Russia. Russian missiles don't need visas. You know, I never thought that I would have to live through a war, and neither do you, for now. But remember that the peace you have is very fragile, and taking it for granted is the most sure way to lose it. So what can we all do? This winter, we all will be paying the price for the peace. You will pay the price to preserve the peace. We, Ukrainians, will pay the price to achieve it. You will pay the price in euros and dollars. We will pay the price in blood, in the dead, and in the wounded. But the price we all pay will be smaller if we stand together. Ukrainians have shown that with Western aid and weapons, they can stop Russia. If Ukraine gets more help, it can actually end the war. It is simple. The allies need to give Ukraine whatever it asks for, whatever weapons or aid it asks for, because Ukrainians are already making the utmost sacrifice and paying the highest possible price. They shouldn't be begging for help. Ukrainians are fighting for you, the people of free Europe. They are fighting for yours and for our freedom. I don't make forecasts about the war, except for just one. Ukraine will win. It's a matter of time and price. And that price will be decided by Ukraine's partners. If Russia breaks the West with its false narratives and disinformation campaigns, then the price of victory will be unspeakably high. But if the West stands behind Ukraine, united, then the victory will come sooner and many lives will be spared. So which one will it be? Will the free Europe prove Vladimir Putin right and quietly walk out, hoping that something will spare you and the sadistic dictator will not get to you? Or will Europe prove itself worthy of its values, grit its teeth, and stand up to fight, not for Ukraine, but for its own future? Which one will it be? In this war, Ukraine has shown an example of remarkable resilience. I believe that the rest of Europe will find the strength to follow. Thank you. І слава Україні!